So hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Which camera am I? Is there one? No? I just talking? I'm happy just to be a voice, too. My name is Winnie Stackelberg. I'm Executive Vice President of External Affairs here at the Center for American Progress, and I am so excited to welcome all of you, our online audience, this morning for a fantastic discussion. While you are online, please ask questions. Please tweet. The hashtag is YouthVote2020. The narrative, the 2020 narrative, has already begun. Young people don't vote. If you listen to the news, young people are already being taken to task for not voting in the Super Tuesday primaries. But the reality is that youth participation trended higher in last week's Super Tuesday than in comparable election cycles in 2004 and 2012. Today's really important conversation will not be another blame the young voters conversation. Today is about recognizing the potential power of young voters and the leadership that young people across the country are demonstrating when it comes to issues that matter most. Today is also about the responsibility of candidates and campaigns to engage young people, listen to them, and develop policy solutions that address their challenges and their problems, just like they do for other segments of the American population. It is not new news that young people vote at lower rates than older people. Lower voter turnout rates among young people is a systemic problem, and it's one that my generation also encountered when we first began engaging with the democratic system. But there's hope. 2018 saw a significant surge in young people voting, and all indications are that a similar surge will exist in November of this year. We must make it so. But to get there, we need campaigns to invest in the youngest voting eligible populations and to talk about the issues they care about most. I want to briefly tell you about Dorothy from Tampa, Florida. Dorothy was a first-generation college student who did what this country told her to do to achieve middle-class dream. She left college with a degree in one hand and thousands of dollars of debt in the other. Thousands of dollars of student debt. Dorothy had never actively engaged in politics. No politicians ever seemed to be speaking to her or trying to understand the real-life struggles of women of color, young women of color, the daughter of a Haitian immigrant might be facing in her Florida suburb. But in recent years, for the first time ever, she heard presidential candidates talk about the student debt crisis. She felt like candidates were finally seeing the problems she was experiencing and valuing people like her. Dorothy plans to vote in the primary, and she plans to vote in the general election, too. At the Center for American Progress, we believe in the power of young people, and we are encouraged by the work of Generation Progress, which is based here at the Center for American Progress, the only young adult advocacy organization housed within a progressive think tank. Generation Progress works every single day with and for young people to uplift their voices and leadership across the country. And at CAP, we recognize that their work is more important than ever. Please, once again, tweet, ask questions. The hashtag is YouthVote2020. And with that, I invite up Brent Cohen, who is the Executive Director of Generation Progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Winnie. We are grateful for your leadership and support in all of the work that we do. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today via live stream for this exciting event. This morning, Generation Progress released an issue brief on the power of young people to decide the results of the upcoming election, an election that we all know will be extremely consequential. And we should be clear about why this conversation is so incredibly important. Late last year in Boston, the city council race came down to a single vote before recount. Seriously, just one vote. And in Queens, New York, the local prosecutor's race came down to 16 votes before recount. 16 votes in Queens, a city that if it were a standalone city would be the fourth largest in all of America. So this isn't hypothetical or rhetorical, it's reality. Young people's votes matter, and we need candidates up and down the ballot meaningfully engaging and speaking to this powerful demographic. Before I dive in further, I first want to thank the lead author on the paper released this morning, my colleague Emily Leach, for her incredible work. I also want to acknowledge and thank a couple of organizations, namely the Alliance for Youth Action and Circle at Tufts University, for their excellent work conducting surveys and polls and collecting data, which has truly been invaluable to us as we've written this issue brief and conducted our other work in the area. So, at a high level, our report found that there is significant potential for youth turnout to improve in 2020. Voters between the ages of 18 to 35 will make up nearly 40% of the electorate in 2020, with millennials passing baby boomers as the largest generation of Americans. The historical turnout of young people may be low, but when enthusiasm is high, young people have shown a distinct willingness to turn out at much higher levels and get involved. This means that it is up to campaigns to reach them, persuade them, and turn them out to vote in November. Digging just a bit deeper, one thing that we found interesting is that young people have a greater tendency towards political independence than older generations. As you see in the graph, a greater number of young people between the ages of 17 to 35 identify as independents than they do as either strong Democrats or strong Republicans. And in contrast to older Americans, these younger voters are more likely to choose a candidate based on their values or policies than based on party identity. And as this figure shows, Americans between the ages of 18 to 24 and 25 to 29 are significantly less likely to cast a ballot in any given election than older Americans, but voters over the age of 50 are more consistent voters, meaning there's less variance between election cycles, particularly between presidential and midterms. The flip side of this means that there is also significant potential for young voters to engage when the enthusiasm is high and when outreach is deliberate from campaigns. So, what does all this mean? It means that youth turnout has a lot of room to grow. Looking at the population sizes of different age groups, there are 31 million eligible voters between the ages of 20 to 35 that did not turn out in 2016, but could in 2020. It is up to campaigns whether or not they will recognize the significance of this demographic and prioritize investing in them. As we think about where there is room, that delta exists for impact, 31 million is a significant delta for impact. And if campaigns do deliberately prioritize and invest in this demographic, they will need to actually listen to these young people when they talk about the issues that matter to them, like Dorothy, propose policy solutions that address their concerns and priorities, and then make sure to engage young people before the election and after the election in order to communicate those plans and proposals with them. We recognize that reaching young people is not something that many campaigns have been able to do successfully. And one reason for that is that traditional campaigning often makes it difficult for campaigns to meet and engage with young people. According to some data from Circle, nearly 70% of voters 18 to 29 in the 2018 midterm elections were first-time voters. That means that they are unlikely to have public voter files, which most campaigns use to knock on doors, phone bank, and text bank. One answer to this is social media. In a survey, Circle also found that 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds who heard about the election, both on social media and offline through other methods, described themselves as extremely likely to vote, while only 41% who heard about the election from campaigns but did not hear about it on social media described themselves that way. Also, those who didn't hear about the election from campaigns at all but did hear about it from social media described themselves as more likely to vote than those who did not. Social media allows campaigns to meet young people where they are and share their key messages directly. So where do we go from here? We'll talk more about this with our panelists in just a moment, but at a high level, we think that campaigns should provide voter registration and election requirements and deadlines. Over 25 states have enacted voter suppression measures in the past 10 years, and young people who move from one state to another may be unaware of local requirements and deadlines. Providing that information early and often is key. Campaigns should engage young people digitally and meet them where they are, whether it's on social media, at a well-attended concert or public event, or on a campus. It's key to put yourself where young people already are rather than waiting to knock on doors or call phones. And finally, ask them about their concerns and priorities. And I can't emphasize this one enough. Just like older Americans, young people are concerned about their futures and the futures of their families. They want to be able to work, buy homes, save money, and provide for their children. Right now, they are experiencing rising wealth gaps, increased health care, child care, and housing costs, massive student loan debt, and other issues that truly matter to young people across the country. Speak to those problems and tell them how you'll make their lives better with concrete and realistic policy solutions. In short, earn their votes. Before we transition to our panel, I want to mention again that our report on this subject is now live. If you want to take a look, you can visit genprogress.org/youthvote. That's genprogress.org/youthvote, or contact our senior press associate at the email address that's there on your screen, eleach@americanprogress.org, and she will send you a copy directly. And with that, I am excited to transition to our panel. We've got three incredible experts, and I will introduce them momentarily. All right, so thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Here, please remember, as Winnie said, the hashtag is YouthVote2020, hashtag YouthVote2020, and you can submit your questions online, and we'll be sure to read them as we talk with our panelists. So I want to begin. I'll begin directly to my right, and we'll just quickly introduce Rainsford Stauffer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And next to Rainsford is Nicole Hensel, the Executive Director of New Era, Colorado, and Don Baldwin, the Deputy Executive Director at Alliance for Youth Action. Thank you so much, all three, for being here. So as we begin this panel, if you could just, Rainsford, starting, briefly share some of the work that you've done in this area. You've done really incredible and exciting work thinking about and talking with young people across the country, specifically on this issue of youth voting.
Definitely. It's something that I've really tried to prioritize as a writer and a reporter, especially as someone that's from a very red state in a very rural area. I knew a lot of young people who were feeling entirely left out of the political process. And as I kind of dove into those issues, it opened my eyes to the fact that this wasn't just something that was occurring in my geographic location. It's a national issue. And so I've had the privilege of talking to young people all across the country of all different races, backgrounds, levels of interest in politics and political engagement on what they'd like to see us do differently in terms of our political process and how they want to be engaged. Because the thing we now know, and we're talking about a lot more, is that young people are politically engaged. It's our job to reach out to them and bring them into the process. They have voices. We just need to amplify those voices.
Absolutely. And as a writer and journalist, you've written about this in the New York Times, Teen Vogue, really across. It seems like there is really a thirst and an appetite for this conversation.
I think we're finally starting to realize that young people, A, are not a monolith, and B, the stories of young people extend far beyond just one niche genre. They impact our society, our economy, our system of higher education, and the workforce. And we're finally starting to see young people as part of our society, not this one group that we've kind of separated off from everything else.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so, Nicole, looking to you, if you could share just a bit about the work that you're doing in Colorado and that New Era Colorado has been doing for years, and something, if there's anything particularly exciting that your organization has underway.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. So I'll just start out a little bit about young people and why they matter and how we think about it at New Era Colorado. When we think about all of the major movements that have happened in our nation's history as well as current times, think of the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, or in current day, March for Our Lives, or the Dreamers, right? When you look at who is on the front lines of those movements, you always see young people. It's been like that since our nation's history and founding, that young people are the moral compass of this country, and they always demand us to do better and be better. And so that's why at New Era, we are emboldened by the mission to empower and mobilize young people to participate in our democracy. So we were founded in 2006 by a group of self-described student government nerds, which I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with. But our founders actually are now huge leaders in the progressive politics in Colorado. So Congressman Joe Neguse, representing Colorado's 6th District, our Senate Majority Leader at the State House, Majority Leader Steve Fenberg, Representative Leslie Harrod, she's my representative, she's amazing, and Governor Jared Polis' Chief of Staff, Lisa Kaufman. Those were our founding four, and they've all been slacking off since. And so since our founding, we have registered over 200,000 voters in Colorado, which when you think about the margins of victory that you were sharing, as well as margins of victory in Colorado, that's a really significant voting block.
You said 200,000.
Yeah, 200,000. Yes, lots of zeros. Lots of zeros. And we don't just register them, we turn them out at crazy high rates. In 2016, our registrants turned out at 82%. That's 22 percentage points higher than statewide youth. And we've doubled midterm turnout between 2010 and 2018 within our state. So in 2018, Colorado had the 3rd highest youth turnout in the country. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we were able to achieve those results, but it just goes to show that when you have campaigns that are on the ground year-round organizing with young people, they do turn out, and they turn out just as high as other generations.
Incredible. Thank you. And thank you for the work that you're doing in Colorado. So, Dawn, turning to you, if you could share a little bit about the work that AYA does and the work that you've done there over the years, and anything particularly exciting that you all have underway.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. As Brent mentioned, I'm Dawn Boudouin with the Alliance for Youth Action, and we are a network of young people-led and young people-focused groups on the ground that are both registering, organizing, and mobilizing young people to vote. My pal here, Nicole, her organization is a part of our network, and so we get to work really closely together on this. But something that I'm really excited about that we've been working at the Alliance on is actually scaling, right? So a lot of our groups are going to run the biggest programs that they've ever done. And so like I get to work really intimately with them around thinking through what this looks like. So we're going to register over 150,000 folks this year in our network. We'll probably do over 2 million voter guides. And so this level of voter contact is like the highest rates that we've ever seen, and like the most registrants that we've seen as a network. So we're really excited to dive in and really work with our groups on the ground to achieve those goals.
That's amazing, and consistent with some of the messaging and conversations we've been having about just the enthusiasm around young people voting in this election cycle, and to hear the work that you all are doing at AYA and the Alliance to really push that forward and help foment that is really inspiring. So one of the things that we looked at when we were writing the issue brief, Dawn, is the AYA recent poll that you all came out with just a couple of weeks ago. And it's just chock full of interesting information. We mentioned a little bit about the less likely to identify with party politics, for example. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that young people are less likely to identify as strong Democrats or strong Republicans than older Americans might?
Yeah, I think you highlighted it earlier that like about a third of young people don't identify with the party. And even when you look at folks that there's even fewer of the folks that actually identify with the party that strongly identify. So it's clearly folks are moving away from the party identification. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that young people don't really care if there's a D or an R beside your name. It's more about the policies and values that you represent. So I think you can see the way in which we approach this is like through our voter guide program. A lot of times, like our voter guide has issues that young people care about, and then it has candidates listed and says, do they support this issue, yes or no? And so it's very easy to decipher whether or not they're with you on the values and actually going to fight for the things that you care about. Because as I said before, they're issue voters and they really care about, are you going to do something to address the rising healthcare costs? I'm underinsured or uninsured, and like I need access to this because I have medical issues, or the economy that we are in right now isn't working for me because I have to work 2 jobs and it's still not enough to deal with the debt that I'm dealing with. So I think young people don't care about D's and R's; they care about what you're actually going to do on the policy front.
So young people don't care about D's and R's; they care about what you're going to do on the policy front. And you mentioned values. And wanting to find elected officials or candidates whose values reflect their own. Rainsford, you've been talking with young people all across the country on this. What issues, values, or experiences have you found that resonate most with millennials and Generation Z?
Absolutely. I think Don nailed it. I think across the board. And what's interesting about this is it's kind of an across communities thing. There are people in very rural eastern Kentucky that are very passionate about climate change, and they know that's a significant issue. Students all across the country and young people all across the country are concerned about student debt. They're concerned about health care. A lot of them are actually concerned about parental care and the fact that eventually they either are currently or are going to be caretakers for their families, and they know that student debt and rising healthcare costs are going to be significant burdens on top of something that's already a lot of pressure. And so one of the most interesting things about the young people I've talked to is that they see all of these issues as intersectional. They don't see student debt as something that's separate from our healthcare system, that's separate from climate change, that's separate from poverty and low wages. They kind of see it all as something that works together, which is why I think that today's young people are so committed to, as you mentioned, voting for candidates and supporting candidates who share their values, because that's the only way to fix something that seems like it encompasses all of these different things.
Yeah, and I will tell you, as a parent with 2 young kids and more student loan debt than I'd like to admit, yes, these things are intersectional and they compound one another. So that certainly resonates with me as well. So, Nicole, hearing this conversation, we've been talking a bit nationally. How does that resonate at the state level where you're doing work in Colorado, and how do you harness that energy among young people to really turn that into political power?
Yeah, absolutely. So completely want to echo what my lovely co-panelists have shared, that young people are driven by issues, not candidates. And so what we do at the local level, since we're on the ground with young people every day, is we try and figure out what those issues are and the exact solutions that they want to them. So a lot of the work that we do at New Era, we not only register and turn out voters, but we do issue advocacy at the Capitol. And right now our big agenda is around student debt. We have a bill that's in the legislature right now that would provide student debt relief for 2 years. It's called Get on Your Feet, literally helping young people get on their feet, start a career, start a family, open a business. And you bet as soon as that passes, you know what I'm going to be telling people when we're knocking doors in the fall? Guess what? Because young people show up in Colorado, legislators have to listen to them and they have to take action on their issues. And so it's this positive feedback loop between issue advocacy and civic engagement that's really at the root of our theory of change at New Era. And that's really what's able to drive the impressive results that you see year after year.
Yep. No, that absolutely makes sense. And being able to combine results and action with on that forefront, and sort of going to the point that was made earlier around votes literally matter, right? An election can come down to 1 or 16 votes, and on the back end of that is are we achieving policy action that was talked about on the front end? So I want to remind folks at home that you can get engaged in this conversation as well. Please, you can tweet at us at GenProgress with the hashtag YouthVote2020. Again, tweet at GenProgress, hashtag YouthVote2020 with your questions or thoughts. We'll be able to get to some of them live during the live stream. Don, coming back to you on the data that we talked a little bit about in terms of traditional campaign methods may not be as effective with younger voters. And this is, again, something that really, I think, was highlighted in the recent poll, and some of the circle data as well that we talked about before. What are ways in which campaigns or candidates can get their message across and can most effectively engage with young people?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, sometimes it's harder to reach young people through traditional methods, but I don't want to encourage people to stray away from that because I want to make that distinction. I do think that young people are more likely to be engaged if you are sending them mail, if you're knocking on their door, and if you are like having these one-to-one in-person conversations. It's like really important to like not stray away from that because I think there is a want to a lot of people to think like, oh, we did a couple of tweets and like that we did our young people.
And we're done.
Yeah, we're good. The young people are going to turn out now. So I like really want to like encourage like social media is a platform to be used to encourage young people to turn out or to reach young people on your messaging because like in some cases it's harder to reach young people, right? They're transient, they're constantly moving. We can't, like the voter files don't update fast enough to keep up with where they are. But I also think that a lot of our groups on the ground, they spend time on campuses. They spend time in places where there's high traffic of young people. So what we do is use like site-based canvassing apps too. So like where if we run into a young person, we're like, are you registered to vote? And they're like, yeah. And then you have them look it up and say, oh, this isn't your current address, is it? And like have them update this in real time. They get re-registered. We also have we can track them in the app to be like, okay, we're going to upload this back into the voter file. So we're getting real-time information. So like these are the types of methods that we like to use to really think about it. But to your point, I think you're trying to get to social media as kind of like one of these tactics to use. I do think that social media is an effective way, but it's one tool in the toolbox and can't be thought of the exclusive tool to reach young people.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And to your point, these things should be working hand in hand, right? It is a tool in the toolbox. And Nicole, how are you using both sort of a social media or digital tools, or even some of the technology that Don talked about, with the on the ground work to engage one-on-one with young people, or one-on-many with young people, if you're able to get to high traffic areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the power is really in what you're saying, the multiple modalities of how we reach young people. So we also know that research shows that all voters, especially young voters, are unlikely to act if they're not familiar with the person who is contacting them, right? If they're a cold contact. So the ways in which that we keep young people in our system is by reminding them that we were the ones who actually registered them to vote. We were at your high school, or we were on campus 2 weeks ago. Remember us? You loved us. And then if we're reaching out with texts or digital ads, like they already recognize our brand. And so that's one of the most powerful things about New Era, since we've been around since 2006. We're a very trusted messenger for young people, and autonomy is very, very important to young people as well as to all people. And so having a trusted messenger is really important. And that's why the year-round organizing that we do, the fact that we are a student group on many campuses, that we're embedded in the student life there. They recognize our buttons. They recognize our T-shirts. They see their, sister's friend from school working for us. That's so important because that trust is what allows us to leverage the other tools and the digital strategy and be more effective in that front.
No, this makes sense, and it's interesting. Professor Ibram Kendi had an article in The Atlantic a few weeks back, perhaps even a couple months ago now, talking about the other swing voter, and the fact that when campaigns and candidates are seeking to engage or attract, oftentimes middle-aged or older white middle America voters, there is a very good and strong push to use multiple modalities to talk about the issues that they care about, that resonate most with them. But some of that strategy is lacking, it seems like, when it comes to younger voters, where the answer is to sort of bang on the table and say, do what's good for you. And so hearing you talk about the messenger matters, hearing you talk about the multiple modalities and tools that we have in the toolbox, these are things that campaigns know how to do, that we in general in sort of the advocacy world know how to do, but seems not always to happen when it comes to engaging young voters. And it should, right, is sort of the bottom line here. Rainsford, one of the things that folks like to say about younger voters, and it's sort of when he kicked us off with this narrative and said this is not that conversation, which is young people are apathetic. Young people don't vote because they don't care. But we know that's not true. We know that's not the case. And so what are some of the things that you found most surprising or most enlightening as you've talked with people and written on this subject about the things that young people not only care about, but the ways that they're getting engaged?
Definitely. And I think this is such an important point because we see it all the time in headlines about, the various industries that millennials are killing and now Generation Z, they're entitled, they don't want to engage. We know that these things are statistically untrue. They are not based in any kind of fact. And I just recently did a whole article on Super Tuesday related to this narrative that the reason turnout was supposedly so low is the young people are lazy. And it's not. The young people aren't turning out because of voter suppression or because they have not been engaged in a meaningful way that would demand that they show up in that way. I spoke to one young voter, I think she was 23, for that article that had been trying to work on her absentee ballot since January. It took 3 attempts, and it ended up with her county clerk suggesting that she pay $30 to $45 to overnight her ballot just to vote. That's ridiculous. First of all, what a financial burden for a young person that may not have that level of disposable income. And second of all, it just shouldn't be this hard to vote. And I think that that's one of the things I keep hearing over and over again from young people, some of whom haven't voted in recent elections, who haven't voted in local elections and didn't vote in 2016. The answer is never, I'm not that interested in politics. And if it is, it's because they think being interested in politics, being involved in a political club or majoring in political science is a prerequisite to even feeling like their voice matters. And so in the reporting I've done, I think that's one of the biggest things we have to overcome. One of the biggest obstacles in reaching young people is this collective realization that politics is something we all participate in. It's not this exclusive club where you have to have this base level interest just to get the information you need to participate. I think that young people now believe that information on how to vote and who to vote for and the values of a candidate should be information that everybody has, regardless of whether they consider politics a hobby.
So politics should not be some exclusive club, right?
Exactly.
This is in democracy, you are eligible, you should know how to have and be able to exercise that right to vote. We worked with a young person who's a student here at Howard University who for months tried to get her absentee ballot from Ohio and was eventually told she needed to travel back to Ohio if she wanted to vote the day of the election.
It's very funny because I vote in Kentucky and had the very same experience in our election back in 2019. It took forever to get my ballot. They suggested I just come home, which of course, if I was able to, I would have just voted in person. And that's a huge barrier because somebody like me, I was super into voting. I wanted to make sure that I did it. I'm really into it. What about a young person that knows that they should, but it's not necessarily something they either have the time and capacity to go out of their way to do or don't feel that invested? We owe it to them to make it easy because if it's easy, they're going to keep coming back and building that habit and sort of flexing that muscle of participating in democracy.
That last point there is so key. This is a systemic issue, and on the other hand, the younger people vote, we know that it becomes habitual. So if you know that you vote every 2 years in a 2 years or 4 years in a midterm and a presidential, that becomes habitual. You begin to flex that muscle, as you say, and it's just something that we do as generations and as young people and then as older Americans. So, Don, what are some of the other, Rainsford touched on voter suppression, and we talked a bit about one of them in the sense of absentee ballots not arriving on time or not arriving at all in some cases, and then the onus being put on young people to either literally buy a plane ticket and go home or drive hours away or to spend $40 to overnight it. What other forms of voter suppression are we seeing that are disproportionately impacting young people?
Several. I think a good example is in Texas, we saw lines that were people being in line on campus 2 hours after polling locations had already closed. Like our group moved Texas down there was in line trying to encourage people to stay and vote, providing pizza and water to keep people engaged and want them to stay in line to flex that muscle that you're talking about. So I think it's several things. I think also not allowing student IDs to be voter IDs and all of it. I think it's endless, right? There's so many ways in which there's different types of suppression that are impacting young people. But I also want to highlight that we often think that young people are apathetic and that they don't want to vote. And I think to your point, a lot of them do, and they're trying to find entry points. But something we found in our poll is that over half of like young Democratic voters hadn't been reached out by a candidate. There hadn't been a single text, there hadn't been a single call, there hadn't been mail, there hadn't been a door knock. So another piece of this is that folks aren't reaching out. So if you're not reaching out to them, why are they showing up? If they don't know what issues, what your values are, what policies you're fighting for, what's the incentive? So.
Right. What's the incentive? So if they're not hearing from you, if they're not understanding where your values are and how they align with our own, with an individual's, and they don't know what the policy solutions are that you're proposing, what is the incentive to hurdle those barriers? And I want to be really clear, there are barriers set up, but we're seeing young people every day hurdle those barriers, knocking them down, running through them. And again, for folks at home, engage with us in this conversation. Tweet at us at GenProgress. And you can use hashtag YouthVote2020. We'll be turning to audience questions in a little while here. Nicole, sort of thinking about the young people that you're working with and that New Era Colorado's been working with for years now in Colorado, how are young people hurdling and breaking down these barriers? And how can organizations like yours and others help to combat these voter suppression efforts, both in the short term in this election cycle and sort of longer term?
Absolutely. So in Colorado, we're really blessed. We are a state that really values voting and voting access. We're one of the best places to vote in the country. But that's also because of the work that our organization has done around election access law. So like I said, we have that feedback loop of advocacy and civic engagement, and a lot of the work that we do at the legislature is around election access. So we were integral in passing the law that allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register so that they are automatically registered the day they turn 18, and that that reinforces the work that we do in high schools to pre-register and register voters. Last year, we helped pass the Colorado Votes Act, which expanded access to polling locations and 24-hour drop boxes on college campuses in Colorado. So before this, in 2018, there were only 2 24-hour drop boxes on any college campus all across the state of Colorado, just 2. And now, thanks to this law, there's going to be about 21 or 22 locations this year. So that doesn't just serve the students, that serves the surrounding community as well, right? And so you bet we'll be working with county clerks to make sure that those drop boxes are placed on accessible locations, that the polling centers, that those hours are publicized on campus. And that's a lot of the work that we do and is part of the findings from your report, which is that simply giving access to information about where your nearest polling location is, where your drop box is, the fact that, okay, you don't have a stamp, like young people don't buy stamps, that's cool. Like there's a drop box just by the student union over there. And so I just want to shout out to the work that our organizers did for the primaries. Part of the Colorado Votes Act was to allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primary if they'll be 18 by the general election. They should have a say on who's on their general election ballot. And so we ran a big campaign educating and doing Get Out the Vote for 17-year-olds. They turned out at 45.2%. in the primary. That's compared to overall turnout of 45.5% in Colorado. So they turned out just 0.3 percentage points lower than the rest of the state. And that's because we had a targeted campaign towards them, right? And so the idea of campaigns not reaching out, there is this latent force of young people that is just waiting to be tapped. And we believe in them. And so that's why 17-year-olds turned out, and we could not be more proud.
Can I just add one thing to that? Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that. Yes, to your point, young people are still getting over those barriers to go vote. And then when you have folks on the ground that are actually engaging, then they will turn out. So I think we see this across our network. A lot of young people find political homes with groups in our network because they feel like we're fighting for the issues that they care about. We're talking to them. We help them stay informed about how to get registered, and then also come back to them to turn them out. And then we also help them hold their legislators accountable. So I think that whole process and getting really involved in that way makes it, even though candidates may not be reaching out, our folks are. And so that's why you still see this increased youth activism and as well as turnout.
And that is a model that should be international, and I know is among affiliates. I sense that this can't happen. This starts in October, November. This is the relationship that developed long beforehand and then continues long after any particular single election cycle. So, and obviously this is a presidential election year, we're talking quite a bit about the, as you refer to, the latent power of young people that's ready to go and potentially can go here as a pathway to victory. But we know that there's local and state races happening up and down the ballot across the country. Nicole, how have you seen young people respond to or get involved in local and statewide races?
Yeah, we find it's actually one of the best ways to engage young people in politics because the issues are so tangible. They so directly impact their lives. If you're talking about banning plastic bags in your city, like that's something that you can tangibly conceive of. And so we do a lot of work at the state and local level at New Era. We also, as Dawn mentioned with our voter guide program, that program is really built and designed to encourage down ballot voting. So we compare candidates on all issues that young people care about all across the ballot. We also endorse on ballot measures because ballot measure language is so confusing, especially if you're a first time voter. I mean, it confuses me. So we break down this is what this ballot means and this is how young people should vote on it. We also do a lot of work in our leadership development program to engage people, young people in the political process. So we train young leaders to testify at the state capitol about why the student debt crisis, how it directly impacts their life. And so again, we're also having young people call their legislators, their state legislators, the day after the election. We did that in 2018. We call them, say, hey, young people turned out at record levels. Guess what? We're about to patch you through to your state representative, and you're going to tell them the top 3 issues that matter to you. And so that is really one of the best ways to help young people see the power of their voice is at that local level where it's very tangible to them. And then they build that power, they build that confidence, they build that habit for a lifetime.
Yeah, Dunn, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to say that what Nicole's talking about is happening all across our network. And so I think it's important to think about the young people that are able to vote right now and getting them engaged and turning them out. But in some places we see our groups even talking to folks younger than that, right? So I think Leaders Igniting Transformation based in Milwaukee, well, statewide now, excuse me. Sorry, Dakota, don't be mad. But they one perfect example is what they did at the school board level in Milwaukee was getting a divestment from putting guards in schools, and so trying to end the school to prison pipeline. And now instead they're putting mental health care professionals in schools to help with various issues that young people are facing. And so the folks that led that effort were 16-year-olds. They were showing up and going to school board meetings and talking to the school board and really engaging in a real way. And then they were going back into their high schools and registering people that were able to vote and talking to them about the importance of their representation. So I think to your point, it's important to get these folks engaged young, and then also to have them talk to their peers about it, and then also find that home and really to have people turn out around the issues and these local races that matter.
To Dawn's point, I think LIT is such a phenomenal example with the work that they've done in regard to the school to prison pipeline in particular. And it's a good reminder that I think that there are a lot more forms of local government than we talk about with young people. It's why, young people should have a seat on the school board. They should have a say in how their schools are run. And I think there's also a major case here, a nonpartisan case for lowering the voting age. I think that when we look into that and the studies that have shown that it's important to build that habit when you're in a typically a more stable family situation, a school situation where you're involved in your local community and can go out and vote in these local races and really see the results of what's happening there, you are more inclined to vote as you move through adulthood. I think that part of the struggle of the youth vote is that we turn 18. For a lot of people, that involves a lot of change, whether it's your location, whether it's how you're spending your time, kind of being away from your community. That's a hard time to add in this entirely new thing you've never done before. And I think that the work in registering 16 and 17-year-olds could not be more important for that reason. And especially with that local investment in being involved in their community, getting to see the issues on the ground that are changing because of who they voted for, it is just the most important thing we could do.
Yeah, I mean, so much here to sort of talk about and respond to, right? So on one hand, talking about local issues, the power of the seat. And I think so often when we talk about elections and we talk about elected officials or candidates, the conversation focuses on president and Congress or Senate. And I think for good reason, there's enormous and immense power there, and it matters in terms of tone setting for the country. But so much of the work that's happening, whether it's in criminal justice or gun violence or a host of other issues, really comes down oftentimes to the city council members or the mayor or the county executive or the state legislature. And so really, I think communicating the power of the seat and that the power of the vote goes beyond federal offices is so incredibly important. And then, Rainsford, it's interesting to hear the talk of potentially lower than voter age, and there's some work that's happening just a few miles from here in Maryland, where 4 cities have lowered the local or municipal voting age to 16, so that 16 and 17-year-olds can vote for local and citywide elections, or citywide, but not in federal yet, because of course that would require federal law change. But it's a really interesting, almost case study to look at whether the combination of pre-registration and lowering the municipal voting age sort of helps create this sort of habit forming, so that voting is just a way of life. And it's particularly interesting in the context of 18-year-olds. You are now an adult. It's bestowed upon you. You are 18, as if 17 in 364 days you are a child, but 18 years old you are an adult. And it's not just voting that happens. So much changes all at once, including criminal justice sanctions, for example. You get moved up. And there's, in my prior life in criminal justice work, really looking at as how should the criminal justice system be responding to someone who's 18 years old and 19 years old versus 17 years old? As a former high school teacher, I could tell you there's no magic thing that happens in that one-day turnaround. And so as folks turn 18 and the power and sort of opportunity and right that is voting comes along with it, what should we be doing systemically to help people realize this, as opposed to just throwing them into the deep end and saying, okay, swim and figure out how to harness this voting now?
I think that's such a good way to put it. And I think that the biggest thing we can do, to the point of my lovely co-panelists here, is that we have to start a lot earlier. This is an incredible amount of information to all of a sudden have to figure out how to navigate when you're 18, and in a lot of cases, navigating everything else that we've, thrust you into adulthood with. I think that civics education is one of the biggest parts of this. And I think that that can look like a lot of different things. I think that we need increased funding for that in public schools, really practical, on-the-ground civics education that teaches you things like, where do I even go to vote in this district? What does a ballot look like? I've talked to so many young people who got into the voting booth and felt like they had a version of stage fright because they've never seen any of this information before. And it's terribly overwhelming when you're trying to make what feels like a very consequential choice. So I think when we invest in programs like that, when we create spaces for the incredible organizations that these two are responsible for to have agency, to have funding, to have momentum, we aren't just targeting, the 2020 election or just this specific block of millennials and Gen Z for that matter. We're creating a system that's more sustainable for everybody. And it's something I think about a lot when I hear the term, a surge of youth voters. We want a surge. And we do, but we also want a sustainable surge. We don't want a one-hit wonder where it's just these particular demographics, this particular time, and these generations. We want to create something that is the new normal in terms of young people getting out and voting. And I think that the way we do that is we start really early with civic education. We build it into our consciousness as citizens of our local communities first. And I think that's where we begin.
I'll just add on to that. Also coming from the field of education, former teacher, field of youth empowerment, the most frustrating narrative that I often hear about young people is that we just expect them to turn 18 and all of a sudden they're just going to know how to be democratic citizens. They're just going to know how to practice democracy when they've never had the chance to practice democracy in their own lives, right? And I have experienced this in our schooling system. We know that much of our schooling system is very directive, and students don't have a lot of agency or autonomy over their learning, and then we just expect them to understand how to participate in a democracy. So we really see our work as New Era as being, how do we become a political home for young people where they can actually practice the act of democracy in their own lives? How can they shape the issues that we take on, the platforms that we advocate for? How can they practice democracy in a place that is safe for them so they can practice democracy in their lives? And so I just wanted to piggyback off of that and also make a call to the field of education around, if we want young people to engage in our democracy, that means giving them democratic control earlier on in their lives.
I also think that means teaching civics. So.
And that means teaching civics. That's exactly right. Like, So, Dawn, how are you supporting, and how is AYA supporting your network and the organizations in your network to do the types of things that Nicole just talked about in terms of providing opportunities and for young people to take agency?
Yeah, I like to think about what we do as more as behind the scenes, right? They're doing all the awesome work on the ground. They need to be able to run the program. So, like, we like to support them from behind the scenes and really make sure that they have their operations in order. We also try to help them think about through their fundraising, help them think through how to scale their program. Like I said, I spend a lot of time thinking about this with them. So we want to make sure that they're healthy on all fronts so that they can run these successful programs that we've seen like at New Era and like really build out where they want to go. And so we try and be supportive as they're thinking through how they like the strategic planning process and through all of these things. So I think of us more as behind the scenes and really trying to be a support network for them as they're facing all these challenges, right? It's hard being a young people-led organization and like really trying to do all of these things and like fighting for a seat at the table within their states and all of this. So it's like trying to be supportive as they're navigating all of that so that they can continue doing the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about finding a seat at the table and fighting for that seat at the table. And Rainsford, you mentioned before young people, students having a seat on the city council or, excuse me, on the school board, for example, given how much impact that has on young people's lives. And Dawn, sort of, you also mentioned the need for fundraising. And I mean, we should just be clear and blunt that it takes money to do this work. It takes money for organizations to do the type of incredible work that Nicole has laid out and that Dawn that you've talked about. And it takes money for candidates or campaigns to adequately and intentionally invest in connecting with young people.
I think to that point, I think it takes similar money that it takes to engage boomers or whoever else. So like I think there's also a want to give less money for youth organizing because there's like, oh, you know, like it's easier
Their passion will sustain them.
That's right, exactly. No, like we need to pay young people
You have
to
fewer
do this
years,
work.
so you need fewer.
Right,
less.
exactly. It's like that's not how this works.
Not how it works.
Oh, and so I think we need to be thoughtful about the investments we're making and making sure that we're doing it in an equitable way that we would do it across the board when we're like helping to fund these organizations.
Yeah, and I'll say the results that we saw in Colorado for the primary with 17-year-olds, that was because we received explicit funding to run a program to do that. Not many of our other affiliates were able to get that early money to run a program, and that's why you saw like an anomaly in Colorado around youth turnout. And that's like just even more of a point around funding and actually running programs is what's going to drive the results, not just laissez-faire attitudes.
I think I'll add to that is like often young people are thought as solely just a turnout group. There needs to be investment in persuasion too, right? So like this needs to start earlier. It can't like to your point, we can't just start talking to folks in October and thinking that they'll turn out in November. We need to start programs as early as possible, get them invested, help them see like what issues are on the ballot and like serve as a mechanism to turn them out and persuade them.
And just to go off of what you all have both said, one of the things that stood out to me so much in reporting and why it is so important that organizations doing phenomenal work like New Era and AYA exist is because I've talked to so many young people who see such a barrier to entry around the financial element of it. And I'm going to paraphrase a quote that I'd heard from a student who was in high school at the time that basically said, you know, come to my rural community where my peers are going to high school all day, they're working for $7.25 an hour and helping support their families, and tell me we need to be more politically involved. It doesn't work like that. And so I think that one of the most incredible things about opportunities like you all provide is it lowers that barrier to entry where you feel like, oh my gosh, I have to pick whether I'm going to go canvass for a local candidate or if I'm going to go work to pay my bills. And I think that's a situation that a lot of young people are in that starts earlier than I think we collectively think that it starts. It's a lot of high schoolers who are working and who do have those responsibilities, and they feel like they're having to pick between, well, what am I interested in and how would I like to spend my time and what can I actually feasibly do. And so when we make politics and civic engagement something that's a part of our social fabric instead of this one-off thing you can participate in, I think it just lowers that barrier to entry so much and creates opportunities for young people who don't always see themselves represented or see a way for them to be represented to really get in there and engage.
Yeah, and so for so much of this conversation, a theme coming out of this conversation is that sustained engagement, not surges, requires early communication, early on, early engagement, the sort of persuasion that you might do with older Americans or different voters, other segments. And so we're in March, right? We're in March of 2020 in one of the most consequential years, election years that we're going to have. And so now is the time for folks who might be listening at home that we are sort of well past that time where engagement and talking to and listening to, and I want to be really intentional about listening to young voters, needs to be happening. How are we talking with folks? How are we engaging with people? Sort of collectively, and that this narrative can't be, well, young people don't vote and therefore we shouldn't invest. The conversation is, how do we invest meaningfully, both time and money, to make sure that we're building a relationship collectively, with building a relationship with young people so that voting is seen and democratic civic participation is seen, not just the act of voting, as something that we do in our lives day in, day out. Nicole?
Yeah, can I just say something around that? I think a lot of what we battle sometimes with folks is feeling like, young voters are a turnout machine and that's it. But we're not actually going to devolve power to them, and we're not going to let them actually have a voice. I know a lot of people who are upset about the way young people are voting, and they say, well, I want to choose when I want to, engage young people when they agree with me. And to that I say, if you're about youth power, then that means you listen, like you were saying, and you devolve power to young people. And you recognize that we are the generation that is going to inherit the problems of climate change, of income inequality. And therefore, we should be on the front lines and in solving those. And so I just want to reiterate there that believing in youth power doesn't just mean believing in them as a turnout machine. It means actually listening to them and listening to their concerns and their ideas for the greatest solutions to our biggest problems.
And just to put some data behind that point, 37% of the voting age population, the potential electorate here, are 18 to 35, Millennials and Generation Z. Thinking about working age Americans, Millennials and Gen Z again, significantly over a third of the population. And so it can't just be turnout machine. We have a ton at stake here, both for ourselves and for many of us, for our children as well, who are coming behind. And to your point, will inherit all of the problems, whether it's healthcare or climate or whatever other issue that exists, because not just thinking about the next 4 years, but really the next 40 years and what that looks like. And so devolving that power and making sure that folks have a seat at the table is so incredibly important. Rainsford, how are you seeing people take that seat at the table, even if it's not being given?
Absolutely. I think that there are so many young people involved in organizations like AYA, like New Era. In Kentucky, where I'm from, there's the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team that does incredible nonpartisan advocacy work around things like students being on the school board, students having a voice in their schools. I've also talked to a lot of young people who are trying to do outreach on their own to register peers to vote and to sit down and have political conversations, because one of the things that they kept hearing was, well, me and my friends talk about politics because we're really interested in politics, but like my next door neighbor, they're not watching the debates every night. They don't care that much. So how do we talk to that person? And I think it goes back to this idea that when you talk to your peers and have peer-to-peer conversations, instead of somebody just sweeping in with a Snapchat filter or an Instagram hashtag and calling it a day, I think that you really see the results in that. I think young people are phenomenal critical thinkers. I think that they are uniquely positioned to see themselves in the context of the world around them. I don't think that they act or think, and you all could probably speak to this better than I can, but they don't seem to act in isolation. They really see it as, I don't want, student debt canceled for me. I want it canceled for, all of my neighbors. I want us all to have an equitable wage, not just me making more than everyone else. And so I think when we have these practical conversations, we have a real opportunity to make it an actual conversation, not just feeding information, not just handing them a packet and being like, make your own decisions. I think it needs to be a lot more of a dialogue. And I think that that's something that our country is finally having sort of a collective awakening about, that when we talk about politics, it can be a conversation back and forth. It's not just handing, a young person an instruction manual and an Instagram filter and turning them loose. It's sustaining that conversation.
A conversation, a back and forth, peer-to-peer is something that you said. And we talked earlier about how important the messenger is on all of this, and what better messenger than one's peers. Don, what can folks be doing to help engage and foment those peer-to-peer conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of want to punt this to Nicole in a lot of ways because she this is the work that she does every day. So Nicole, you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, how we stay peer to peer. Well, it's funny because we have a lot of like supporters who are older and they're like, we want to get out with you in the field and like register voters. And then they get out there for 15 minutes and they're like, we'll just go get the pizza, because it's clear that having young people organizing other young people is the power in what we do. And so we know what draws young people to the table, whether it's buttons, circus performers, or like the issues that they care about. We know how to draw them in. And when they see, like, the important thing about young people and all people is that we're in this stage where we're developing our personal and our political identities, and that never happens in isolation. You know, from being in education, like, we are always forming our identity in community with one another. And so the more that we can bring young people together to form their identities in community, the more sustainable that's going to be, and the more they're going to see themselves as a voter, as a political person, as someone who's engaged in their community. And that's why the peer-to-peer element is what makes us unique. And so if you want to come out and support, go get us the donuts, and then let the young people do the rest.
I mean, that is part of allyship, right? Is identifying where you bring the most value and where you get out of the way and let the folks most impacted carry the water. So, Don, some of the work that AYA has been doing recently, as we talked about at the top of the live stream here, has been around polling and framing and really providing, I think, some critical information to the field to say what you might have thought was happening is in fact not what's happening, or this is what you need to know. So, what do folks need to know, and what are some of the top lines that perhaps came out of some of your recent polls that you think are either we haven't touched on or that need to be reemphasized?
Yeah, I think one thing that is important to know is that young people are engaged, and I think we've all touched on this in some way through our remarks, but I just really want to go against that level that often we are thought of as apathetic, and like that is not actually the case, right? Young people are talking to their friends and families about the issues, just like you mentioned, Rainsford. They're also engaging by listening and watching and reading about what's happening in the news. Like, we found this through our poll, as well as just like when we talk to young people, like we learn this, we hear this from the field. So I really want to highlight that it's not that they're apathetic, we just need to actually have investment to go turn them out, right? So our groups are on the ground doing this work, providing political homes, but like this work, it isn't, you can't do it for free, like as great as that would be, but like, no, we need people to be investing in the groups that are on the ground actually doing this. And like, candidates also need to invest in actually trying to turn out young people. And to everyone's point, that it needs to be a conversation, right? We need to figure out what is plaguing young people. Like, a lot of folks think like, oh, we'll just talk about student debt and like how we're going to do something around that, and then that's enough. No, young voters aren't single voter issues. Like, I mean, single issue voters. I said that. So like, we care about everything just like everyone else. And I don't know why we always get like, with young people, they're just like this other kind of human almost. It's like, no, we're just like everyone else. We care about a lot of different things, and like, there are a lot of issues that speak to us. Yes, you need to invest in us to turn us out. Like, all of those things are true, and I don't know why that mindset's so different around young people. So I think that we just need to think of young people as we think of boomers or like any other constituency that we want to turn out, and be really thoughtful about that, right? And have those conversations and really think about that early investment and all of that. So that's what I would highlight.
So I'll say one takeaway from this exchange right here is that young people are real humans,
Right.
and we care about more than one thing at a time. And so I mean, I know this is sort of like groundbreaking stuff, but it almost feels like groundbreaking stuff in this field,
does.
which is remarkable, right? We are real humans with more than one issue that we care about, and so talk to us about the things that are impacting our lives. And I'll also say, young people are not a monolith. Just like black voters are not a monolith, just like older voters are not a monolith, just like white voters are not a monolith, et cetera, down, up and down. There are different things will resonate with different people for different reasons, whether it's geographic, whether it's 18 to 24 versus 25 to 30, right? There may be different needs, whether a young person's a parent or not a parent, whether it's, and we know also that it's not young people and then voters of color and then women voters, that we have young women of color voters. And so really being intentional about how we're talking about the population and responding and engaging is just so incredibly important here. Nicole, I saw you looking to jump in here.
I was collecting my thoughts. I just wanted to name the point that young people actually, I think, are the least likely to be single issue voters because we're more intersectional in our approach. We are the youngest, most diverse, most progressive generation that has ever lived. And we did a youth agenda survey a few years back that asked young people what are the issues that matter the most to them. And what came back was that they cared about all the issues. And this is where speaking to young people's values becomes really important, because all of us are values voters, not issue voters. We know that. And it's candidates that are speaking to the values that young people hold that is the most important. And when you're thinking about young people values, and you're thinking about the era that we've grown up in, I'm talking about the economic recession. I'm talking about Black Lives Matter. Climate change. Like we see these issues as intersectional, and we see them related to the values that we have as a society. And one of my favorite political philosophers, because we all have them, Danielle Allen out of Harvard. Don't you? Everyone has one, right? Okay, just me.
We're not going to test everyone.
Okay, perfect. Says that the process of politics is determining what is the value set that you want to use to guide your country. It's a negotiation of values. And young people have a particular set of values because we are the ones who are going to live with the problems for the longest. And so you have to, as a candidate, you have to be speaking to those progressive values with that long-term vision.
Absolutely. I admire the work that he's done, and hearing you have a personal favorite there.
Look her up. She's great.
Excuse me. So, and this is something when he referenced it at the outset in terms of this is something that her generation dealt with as well. And if you look back at generations before, and this is not a millennial or Generation Z quote unquote problem. You go back to 1984, you go back to 1988. I think voter turnout was in fact higher in 2012 among young people than it was in 1988. And so we know that people get older. Those are the same people who are now voting at higher rates. This can start sooner, and it's incumbent on all of us and on the field itself, whether it's candidates or campaigns, organizations, the sort of national dialogue to really begin engaging and communicating sooner. I want to remind folks who are with us on live stream that they can engage in this conversation as well. You can tweet at us at Gen Progress, and the hashtag is YouthVote2020. We're talking today about all the ways in which to harness the political power and agency of young people really as a pathway to victory here in 2020, but a much broader conversation about the political power that young people hold, not just in this election cycle, but in this country, from state and local to federal and national elections, and also to, as something we've talked about, holding elected officials accountable on the back end. So folks come forward and say, hey, I stand with you. These are my values. Someone gets into office. What does it look like once someone gets into office? How can young people continue to exercise agency and really hold them accountable, Nicole?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a lot of work at the state level to ensure that our agenda is being pushed. And that's a recent development for New Era. We hadn't always done a lot of advocacy, but we're starting to see now that legislators are asking where we stand on issues before they make a decision, which is really exciting because they know of our political power. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg sort of situation. Do they care about us because they know we have political power, or do they care about us because of the issues that we're advocating for? But that's why like the integration of advocacy and civic engagement is so important, because they know that our young people turn out, and so they should have an answer on our issues. I think something else that is really important here is getting young people into office. And we have a track record at New Era of a lot of our alumni going into elected leadership, and then they become allies for us in the Capitol. So like I said, our state Senate majority leader is is the first executive director and one of the founders of New Era. We've got county clerks who are helping us make sure that we're putting ballot boxes in convenient locations. And like I said, we've got people in Congress here that are advocating for young people. And so it's not just advocating for our issues, but also giving young people that leadership development so that they go on and become elected officials themselves.
We, to that point, we had at Generation Progress a report that came out a couple of years back called Generation Without Representation that really talked about the just incredible low representation in Congress for millennials, and the fact we looked at the national average age versus the average age of those who were in Congress and Senate, and you just see this huge gap, right? And from the median age in Congress versus the median age across the country, and that's just one example. We've talked quite a bit about local and statewide government and how important that is as well. We saw some of that begin to shift a little bit in 2018. Where you had younger members of Congress elected, certainly not proportional to the median age, but a dent, if you will, a beginning of pushing in the right direction, so that we do have generations with representation, recognizing how important it is to have folks with similar experiences, how important it is for other young people to see folks in seats of power and say, that could be me. That is not some exclusive club that exists when you turn 55 or 65 years old, but is in fact something that is accessible.
I think the other piece of that was like the diversity of the folks that were filling that. And so it was like a lot of people could see themselves in those elected officials now. Like, oh, that could be me. Like, I see somebody that looks just like me in so many different ways and so many, all my different identities that I am like, oh, I could potentially do this. Or this isn't like something that is only for older people anymore.
I think that's right, and you're seeing organizations and other advocacy groups that are beginning to pop up and encourage folks to really seize that mantle, to, as we say at Gen Progress, to seize our power, recognizing that we need that seat at the table, that so many of these decisions will affect us. Rainsford, is this a conversation that you're hearing as you write and talk with folks about this?
Definitely. I think that representation and the idea of representation is one of the biggest things that young people are talking about right now, because as we know, people of any age, it's very hard to imagine yourself in a position of power if you've never seen anyone that looks like you or is from where you're from or has anything in common with you in a position of power. And I think that, I don't have data to back this up, but I also think that there's a relationship between the level of trust and the level of understanding when you have an elected official that knows where you're coming from, that's a part of your demographic, that lets you see glimmers of yourself in them. Because I think that to your point about identities, so much of this is about shaping a personal and political identity and ideology, and sort of even outside the ballot box, how you want to govern your own life, the kind of person you want to be in the world. And so it makes sense, if that's kind of how we're going to think about this, it makes sense that having elected officials that you identify with could be a game changer in terms of getting people not just to engage as voters, but to eventually think, well, maybe one day that's supposed to be me. Maybe it's one day people from my community, someone that looks like me or talks like me. And I think we can only ever use more of that.
I'll just add, I think there's an argument to be made about why young people are the best people to be solving these problems. We say at New Era, it's our future, we decide. And so it's about representation and the powerful message that sends, and it's also about the unique experiences and identities that young people hold that make them the best problem solvers on these issues.
That's absolutely right. And I would also, for folks who might be listening at home, saying simply being a young person and running is not enough. Right. It still comes down to values. It still comes down to policies. It still comes down to listening to other young people. I think there's an assumption oftentimes in this field across a whole variety of demographics where they say, if you're a young person who's running, you're going to get the young vote. If you are a black candidate, you're going to get black voters. And we talked at the outset that, one, voters are not a monolith, and two, that it's about values and looking to hear, and I think there's a greater likelihood of hearing a candidate who maybe can speak to your values or have similar experiences and therefore is looking to address those issues in a similar way. But identity in and of itself is not enough. It also needs to come with values-based leadership. It has to come with the policies, and it needs to come with the engagement and communication at every step along the way. Young people are engaged and informed voters, which is not the prevailing narrative. But we know to be true, and we know that young people are getting their information from social media, from news sites, from online news sites, and also from the news and other more traditional methods as well. So I want to continue to engage people who are at home that they can engage with us up here over the next few minutes with hashtag YouthVote2020. Again, hashtag YouthVote2020. And you can tweet directly at us at GenProgress. So our first question coming from the online community and live stream community. Nicole, what suggestions do you have for young people and first-time voters?
Yes, and I think it's talking specifically about young people who might be disillusioned by our political process. Yep, there we go. Lots of things there. Voting process, voter suppression efforts. Yeah, absolutely. So those are real. That is like a real concern, and it's very disheartening to go and try and exercise your political power for the first time and be met with so much opposition and so many obstacles. What I would say is that in order to keep people inspired, we do a lot of that by like keeping people in the polls, like in the poll lines, like Dawn was saying. But we also like know that you have advocates that are there making sure that our election access laws are better. So we have people on the ground before all the days before election day, ensuring that poll workers are delivering correct information to young people. Sometimes poll workers will say, oh, well, your financial aid is dependent on your state of residence and you can't actually vote here because you were born in another state, right? It'll be a lot of people don't want young people to show up and vote. And so we make sure that we have folks on the ground that are very well versed in election access laws so that poll workers and county clerks are held accountable to the actual law. And so also knowing that like young people are the most likely to take advantage of same-day voting. I'm a precrastinator. I'm not a procrastinator. It's a whole different set of problems. I do things way too early. But many of us are procrastinators, or we don't have stamps to mail in our ballots. And so it's very, very important that we keep and expand access to same-day registration and same-day voting for young people. So even if it's if they're contacted by a campaign day of, they can still exercise their right to vote.
Yeah, same day registration. So we talked a little bit earlier about the incredible work you did around pre-registration to get 16 and 17-year-olds eligible to register. So when they turn 18, they're ready to go and vote. Same day registration is another one of these pro-voter reforms that we know has incredible impact, positive impact, particularly on young people, but not just on young people, where folks might show up and maybe they've moved or they haven't registered in time. And so they can register there on the spot, cast a real ballot, and have their vote counted. Another one is automatic voter registration, where 16-year-olds, for example, when it's combined with pre-registration, a 16-year-old gets their driver's license for the first time, and at the same moment, they're registered to vote. So when they turn 18, again, they're ready to go. So going back to online questions, Rainsford, how do you think we can not only get young people to vote, but keep them engaged and keep them coming back beyond a single election cycle?
Definitely. I think it's a really good question, especially when we're talking about young people who may not necessarily identify as or consider themselves activists, who are sort of in the game and in a long-term way. I think it goes back to the conversation, though, that we've had about the importance of civics education, the importance of voting in local elections, and making this part of a sustained effort to keep the conversation going. You know, I remember that prior to 2016, I don't really remember having a ton of conversations with my peers or with my teachers or even in my family about elections that didn't occur every, 2 or 4 years. These conversations were happening, but they were happening sort of in isolation where, oh, there's an event coming. We know we need to vote. Let's watch the debate. And that's great. But democracy, as we know, is not something we can participate in every 2 years or every 4 years and have it turn out in a way that feels okay. And I think that that's been one of the biggest things that I've heard from young people is they're looking for ways to get involved on a year-round, every year basis. They don't just want to pop up once every couple years and be like, okay, we're here and we're ready. And I think in turn, they don't want elected officials that are going to do that either. They don't want people that only are going to check in with them when, hey, I need you to reelect me. I'm going to reach out to you now. They want to be in conversation with their elected officials. They want to know how to have those conversations and feel like that's accessible. You know, in Kentucky, Mitch McConnell is our senator. There have been multiple student sit-ins or sit-ins involving young people at his offices, both in Kentucky and in DC. And it's because they don't feel like they have access to the person that's supposed to be representing them. So I think a great way to handle this, in addition to creating more opportunities for civics education and engagement, is our elected officials kind of stepping up and making sure those lines of communication are open all the time, not just when they're campaigning.
Don't call me every October and expect me to show up the next November. Or not even every October, every second October, or 6th or 4th, depending on what the election cycle is. But that conversation needs to be ongoing. So, Dawn, I know you're a DC-based organization, but with national network. Thinking a little bit about how is a DC-based advocacy organization, particularly one that may not have the same type of state or local network that AYA does, how can we play a part in engaging the youth vote at the state and local level?
Yeah, I think it's about reaching out to the groups on the ground that are actually doing the work and actually engaging young people. So figuring out what that partnership can look like, but also following the lead of the people that are on the ground, because they actually know how best to mobilize the young people that they're reaching out to. They've been there, they do this every day. So like really respecting the lead of the state-based groups. And so like I'm happy to talk to folks that want to figure out how to get connected with our groups and like really work through that. But I think it's mainly about letting the folks on the ground lead, because they know what's best for the folks that they're mobilizing, and then really just figuring out what the role you can play as a partner.
So these are not the same things, but I want to draw a parallel from this conversation with one we had earlier about older volunteers in Colorado and allyship and what that means, and like not necessarily thinking you know what's best for an organization or a group that you're not a part of, but saying, how can I follow your lead? What does that look like? Where are there gaps that I can support, or where's there a role that you think would be helpful for me to play, but really following the lead of the organizations on the ground, and not looking to take over that process.
Yeah, I'll say one of the most dangerous things with young voters is disinformation. And sometimes what happens when outside groups try and come into our state is they don't actually know the election access laws in Colorado. So they'll say things like the registration deadline is October 10th. Well, there is actually no registration deadline in Colorado. Or they'll say you have to be a Colorado resident. That's not true. You just have to have lived there 22 days before the next election. And so oftentimes there can be, in good spirits, more harm done than good. And that's why empowering local folks on the ground who know the context, who know the local laws is so vital.
So we both need to fight disinformation that's coming from Russia and other foreign entities that's coming with
good people
with bad
trying to do good
intentions,
things.
and disinformation from good people trying to be helpful
everywhere.
and do good things. Really important point. Really important point. The folks, local organizations or statewide organizations, are going to be the expert on what's happening on the ground with the community and with the state laws. So I want to open this question up to all three of you. We've talked a bit about the barriers that young people are facing, and how young people are hurdling and running through those barriers. But how do we walk the line of educating young people on systemic voter suppression that they're up against, and we, I think, should acknowledge that they're up against, but how do we walk that line between educating young people on the voter suppression while also underscoring how powerful their vote and their electorate can be? How do we build their trust in government at the same time? I don't know.
Goes. I'll take a crack at it. I think this is so important, and this is the same thing when you look at any marginalized community that has experienced voter suppression, right? How are we supposed to tell folks to show up and exercise their power when they know that this system wasn't designed for them? What we talk about often at New Era is that, when we look at the ways, when we look at government forms, when we look at the best way for people to reach their potential, like democracy is the best system we've got. And democracy only works best when we all show up, and we all show up as our authentic selves. And so a lot of the work that we do with young people is actually using the narrative around voter suppression as something to light their fire about why their vote is so powerful, right? There is a reason why the right to vote is the first thing that people try and take away when they're trying to oppress a community. And that's because they're afraid of their power. And so we use that narrative around disenfranchisement to enfranchisement as a way to fuel the fire of young people, to say, look, people are concerned about what it would mean for you to show up. And that's why it is more incumbent on you to show up and exercise your power in this way.
And just to echo everything you said, I think that there's a great point to be made as far as building trust in the government. That's why we need young people in our government. And if we want young people in our government, that means we've got to show up to vote. We've got to have young voters who are going to vote on the values of a candidate that they feel really represents them. And I think igniting the fire is such a great way to put it, because if we want a government that looks more like us, a democracy that works the way we feel like it needs to work to be sustainable, the only way to do that is to fight back. And I think that that's something that young people are so uniquely tenacious and passionate and capable of doing. I think that they're so invested in their communities, both locally and nationally, that they're sort of uniquely positioned to be the ones that enter the game and change the entire thing.
Amazing. So we are coming up to the close. I want to give everyone an opportunity for sort of last word here, either to emphasize something that we've touched on, or to perhaps touch on something that we hadn't yet got to. Don, can we start with you?
Yep, I think I just want to reiterate that young people are normal humans. Bring that back again. No, but in all seriousness, I think that early investment in mobilizing young people is key to making sure that they turn out, because like I said, it's not all about turnout. It's also a level of persuasion and really drawing that connection between the values and issues that they care about. So I think really thinking about how we can continue to invest in groups that we see in our network to help mobilize them even when there's not an election on the ballot. Like, it's also about like engaging them in accountability efforts and issue advocacy efforts. So I think those are two things that I just want to highlight. And I think the multiple modalities is key too, right? So not just, we did some tweets and a couple of IG posts, we're good, young people are going to turn out for us. No, like, you need to reach out to them, talk to them, have that dialogue that we mentioned, and like really get to understand how these issues are impacting them and what their reality is and how you're going to help address that.
Yeah, I think that I'd just like to stamp the idea of power and what it means to have power with young people, not power over young people. And that means listening to the issues that matter to them and to the values that they hold dear, and actually addressing those. Our rallying cry this year at New Era, our North Star, is building lasting youth power towards a Colorado that fights for humanity and dignity. And we know that humanity and dignity is going to be up and down our ballot in a lot of different ways. And when we think about young people and the ways in which they have always led on movements towards justice and fairness, like, that is the issue that matters the most to the young people that we serve. And so we actually become a better country, a better society, when we listen to the moral compass of our young people and we fight for the humanity and dignity of all.
Definitely. And I think the thing that I would just like to echo is how grateful I am for the work organizations like yours and so many other organizations, both on a local level, a national level, are doing, because I think that we're seeing time and time again how critical that work is. And from my perspective as a writer and reporter, I would just encourage people to find a young person in your life. And if you are a young person, find a peer and have a conversation with them about this. I think that we would be astounded to know how much is weighing on the minds of our nation's youth and how critically they're thinking about so many things. So I would encourage us, first of all, to have those conversations. And second of all, if you're a young person thinking through these issues, know that, as you all mentioned, there is a political home for you. There's a place for you in this democracy. And I think more than anything, we need you.
We need you. So to wrap, young people are real humans. We're not single issue voters. This is a sustained conversation, not a one-off 2 weeks before the election. And we as a country and as a democracy are better when young people are voting, running, in it for the long term. I want to thank our incredible panelists, Don Boudwin, Deputy Executive Director at the Alliance for Youth Action, Nicole Hensel, Executive Director at New Era Colorado, and Rainsford Stelfer, who's a freelance journalist and writer. Grateful for you sharing your expertise and experience with us. Thank you to everyone at home on live stream for watching, or at work on live stream for watching. Really grateful to have you joining with us. Please go to genprogress.org/youthvote and check out our new report, The Pathway to Victory in 2020. Young people are the pathway to victory in 2020. Thanks so much for joining us. Talk to you soon.